Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is Julia Barnes. She is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and director of the films Sea of Life and Bright Green Lies. Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have done some beautiful filmmaking in your programs. Your Sea of Life film shared your journey around the world looking at the environmental issues. You have a lot of gorgeous underwater footage. Where did you go?
I traveled to 7 different countries when I was making Sea of Life, but the main places where I was filming underwater were Florida, the Galapagos Islands, this little area in Mexico called Cabo Pulmo. That was a beautiful marine reserve where life came back to the ocean after there was almost nothing there. I also shot some of it in Australia, also the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico.
You certainly covered different critical areas, and you wanted to get across the importance of oceans and how we can't lose our fish, that they are so integral to the ecosystem. The oceans and the land are both critical ecosystems. Where do you place them in importance?
The most important thing for life on the planet is the ocean, because all life originated from the ocean, and right now all life is dependent on the ocean. So we could not survive on land without the little plankton in the ocean who actually produce most of the oxygen in the air that we breathe. So the ocean is really the foundation of all life on the planet.
In addition to showing this beautiful wildlife and environments, you also documented some rallies, the People's Climate March in New York and the protests at the COP21 in Paris. What was it like to be within those citizen marches and rallies that were trying to raise attention to our environmental crisis?
It was really interesting because on the one hand it's very inspiring to be surrounded by so many people who share a common cause and want to do something, and to see that just so many people care. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, so obviously they were concerned about what was happening to the planet, and that was amazing. But then on the other hand, it was kind of a disillusioning process, because every time after one of these events would take place, they were trying to achieve a certain result. They were trying to pressure the government to do something, and the actions were never sufficient. We never really got what we were asking for.
You believe that some of the real solutions is bringing back nature into our life and having the ability of forests, fish, grasslands, etc., to sequester carbon. We need those ecosystems. We need that wildlife.
Absolutely. That's really important. So much of the wildlife on our planet has been removed and has really been decimated. So we don't have hardly any of the forests left, certainly not old-growth forests that we used to have. There was a study that came out recently, actually, that said there's only 3% of the remaining ecosystems are intact. So all of the rest have been degraded in some way. 90% of the fish are gone from the ocean, 50% of the coral reefs are gone. And what we don't realize is that all that life that is missing once played a role in the carbon cycle. And all that life can sequester carbon. So yeah, if we were to bring that back, we could pull an enormous amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's something that's really important to do when we think about the ocean, because there's already too much carbon in the atmosphere that even if we stopped releasing carbon dioxide emissions today, ocean acidification would continue for several more decades. So it's important that we not only curb emissions, but also pull carbon out of the atmosphere before it gets absorbed into the ocean.
One of the problems of human beings is that we don't see this incredible loss, those percentages of how little old-growth forests and wildlife is left is not visible to us every day, and therefore people don't really see what a crisis we have. Of course, that's why you make documentaries.
Absolutely. And a really important concept that I learned while making Sea of Life was this thing called shifting baseline. So the idea that each generation gets used to a new level of normal. So we look around outside today and we see what's there and we think, yeah, that's how many birds there should be. And maybe we see a decline in our lifetime, or that's how many forests there should be. But we don't realize how much has been lost before we even came into the picture. So I think films are a good way of showing through imagery what a healthy ecosystem really looks like, what the world used to look like and probably should look like.
What was the message you were trying to bring out in Bright Green Lies? Because I know that you are concerned about how the mainstream environmental movement has been co-opted by consumerism, by commercial companies and other entities.
Absolutely. So when I was making Sea of Life, I was getting exposed to a lot of the messaging from the big green environmental organizations and huge focus on climate change, as there should be. It's a hugely important issue. But what was often being presented as solutions were just investing in green technology and manufacturing a whole bunch of solar panels and wind turbines. For me, learning about the problems with the natural world and my understanding of things from the perspective of the ocean was that we have this problem that is so much bigger than this, right? Like, this is just a symptom of the problem, but the fact that we have an infinitely growing extractive economy and that so much of the planet has been decimated, and that seemed to be kind of dropping off the conversation when it came to environmentalism. And so I was always kind of curious about where everything fit in, and the last person who I interviewed for that film was Derek Jensen. I asked him one question about renewables and whether he thought that they were this great solution that everyone said they were. And he told me he was working on a book all about this issue called Bright Green Lies. And he just started telling me some statistics that really blew my mind, like the fact that renewables are expected to be the #1 cause of habitat destruction by the middle of the century. And I realized that all the extraction, all of the manufacturing, all of the processes that go into these things, it's actually quite harmful. And I just thought this was the most important issue that I could make another documentary about, because we have a really large and impassioned environmental movement right now. But no matter how big or impassioned a movement is, if it's pushing for the wrong solutions, it's not going to work.
You have made a distinction between something called bright green versus deep green environmentalism. What's the difference between those two, plus just environmentalism in terms of caring about the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So bright green environmentalism is kind of characterized by this form of environmentalism that basically views the problems as a design challenge and something that can just be kind of, we can tweak things a little bit but keep the system pretty much how it is and achieve sustainability. So there's a huge emphasis with bright green environmentalism with technology as being a solution and design as being a solution. It takes as a given the system that we have right now and attempts to change it a little bit, change aspects of it to make it more sustainable. Whereas deep green environmentalism kind of looks at the system that we have right now as being the root of the problem and sees that we need to have radical changes to the way that we function as a society in order to be sustainable, that we can't just slap a new energy source on there and continue things as they are and expect it to be okay.
You mentioned that even renewable energy technologies have ecological problems. We know that traditional energy sources from coal and hydro are very problematic in terms of pollution and other problems to our systems. But we seem to forget that sometimes even wind and solar require certain technologies. Technology that we all are using these days, our computers, our cell phones, require rare elements and metals, and all of it has problems. So we're not going to get rid of technology. Are you researching and documenting what can be done and what can be used?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that these so-called green technologies are just not this like pure and carbon-free thing that people are saying they are. Fossil fuels are required at every stage of the production process, and on top of that we're seeing that as the energy is being added to the grid, it's not displacing other sources, but because the economy is growing and energy demand is infinitely growing, the energy is just being eaten up by, new things like data centers or additional shopping malls that are being put in, but the overall amount of energy that is being consumed grows. The way of life we have right now is simply not sustainable. Max Wilbert, who is one of the authors of the book Bright Green Lies, told me that the average person living in North America today has the equivalent amount of energy at their disposal as if they had 100 slaves working for them all the time.
Tackling our lifestyles, tackling consumerism is so critical. But one of the issues that is not being discussed as much as it was when I started in the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, and when I did my Emmy-nominated special documentary on population in the United States back in the late 80s, is the fact that we have a carrying capacity on this planet of how many people we can adequately support so everybody has a decent lifestyle. We have passed the 2 billion mark. We're heading up to 8 billion, 9 billion. Do you think that we might be able to get the environmental movement and the public to recognize that we do have to deal with that issue as a core solution to the environmental problems?
Absolutely. It's so important, and we ignore it at our peril. It's going to have to be dealt with one way or another. But the reality is that every species has a carrying capacity, and the amount of humans that there are has grown so much above our carrying capacity, has come at the expense of all these other species even being able to survive. I mean, we're losing 200 species every single day.
In doing your documentaries, you encountered other critical issues that need to be covered. What are those topics, and what is your next documentary?
I'm hoping to make a film called How Change Happens that will be looking at the history of movements and strategy and what's worked and what hasn't, because I think the environmental movement has turned so much into just having these kind of one-off events where people come out to protest for one day, on a weekend when it's convenient. And I think we've lost sight a lot of just the diversity of tactics that are out there. Obviously, this movement isn't very effective right now. The world is still being destroyed.
In your documentary, Sea of Life, you went to 7 different areas. Were those chosen because they were the easiest to get to, or are there some areas that should be being documented but are just too hard to get to and to work in?
That's interesting. Definitely it wasn't chosen because they were the easiest to get to. Some of them were quite difficult, like the Galapagos Islands. Some of the places that I went in Mexico, you had to take like a car for 4 hours and then a boat ride for 6 hours to get to this tiny little island, to this place where you could film crocodiles underwater. So yeah, it was more to do with where I thought I could get either the best footage to show people, the stunning, beautiful side of the ocean, or where I could cover the issues that were the most important.
When you were filming underwater, you had many different species swim around you. Which one did you respond to the best?
My favorite species is the great hammerhead shark. So that's the ones that you see at the beginning of Sea of Life and at the very end. And it was just a magical day swimming with them. Perfectly clear water, and they're just this species that is so big. Like, they're the largest species of hammerhead in the world. And they have incredible personalities. They're absolutely beautiful looking. They're kind of like curious and shy at the same time.
Sharks get a lot of bad press because people think they're dangerous, but not all of them are. And of course, they are top of the line predators in the ocean and are very much needed. We should give more consideration to such species.
Absolutely. And shark populations have decreased by about 90% due to commercial fishing. A lot of them are caught as bycatch each year and just wasted. So there's a huge threat to shark populations, and sharks are so important to the ocean. They kind of control everything there, all the species below them.
You're based in Canada. I'm based in the United States. We are technologically advanced countries, considered developed countries, and yet our impact, even though our populations are fewer than in other places in Africa and Asia, is greater because of the amount of resources that we utilize. Don't we have some sort of obligation to try and help the developing countries not copy what we have done because we've done so much wrong, but to move forward in a new way, in a new green way?
Yeah, I hope that other countries can learn from our mistakes. People shouldn't really look to countries like Canada or the U.S., for example, but we should try and look to cultures that have lived sustainably and that are still living sustainably, like indigenous cultures around the world.
I do look forward to your future documentaries, and I think it's wonderful that you are educating the public in such an excellent way. I want to thank you for your good work. I want to thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have been speaking with Julia Barnes. She is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and director of Sea of Life and Bright Green Lies. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.